We are here with Emily Elizabeth Kernkamp, born July 23rd, 1923.
Right.
And were you born here in the Chicago area?
No, I was born in Minnesota, actually in St. Paul, where we had a family farm just out of St. Paul. But my mother made it to the hospital for each of us.
That was a challenge back then.
Yes, it was, because you couldn't always depend on roads. July wasn't a bad time to go.
Especially in Minnesota, when you have long winters. So are you the oldest?
No, I have two brothers older. Ted is 3 years older. John was 2 years. Jim a year younger. And then we called them the three girls, were about 3 years apart, younger than I was. So it was Ruth and Isabel and Eloise. And one of my nieces was in college, and they wanted something funny about names. She'd say, "Oh, my aunts have the funniest names. Emily, Ruth, Isabel, and Eloise," and always got a laugh.
Kids are always looking for funnies, yeah. Well, just tell us a little bit about your growing up and your experience.
Actually, I could go on for ages about growing up. There were lots of advantages of being on a farm. And some of my earliest memories are things that we did. One of the things I remember about when I was about 4, my dad was unloading potatoes down in the basement from the truck, and of course the wheels were really large. So I wanted to get into the truck, and he leaned over the side and helped me climb up. And as I came up the wheel, when I got near the top, one of my mittens came off, and I dangled by one arm, and it broke the arm. And then the next summer, for a farmer to take off field work to help with putting kids to bed for naps, Mother was having the ladies' aid. And they had Dad put Jim in the bed, and I'd get out. He'd put me in bed, and Jim would get out. Ordinarily, he just stopped us with one swat, and we'd have stayed where we were supposed to. And I got to the head of the stairs, and he took my hand, and I jumped out over the stairs, and he knew, and I knew the arm broke as I went out. So he carried me downstairs, and I put on a good show for all the ladies. I cried, great big crocodile tears. And somebody said, "Well, what happened to me?" And I lifted my head and I said, "Daddy broke my arm again." Now, hey, he wouldn't have a chance.
That's right.
Yeah. And then the time we were Mother was again going to ladies' aid. It was probably the next summer. Anyway, Ruth was a baby, and she had made us twin outfits. I had a brown skirt, Jim had brown pants, and then yellow tops with a midi collar and brown trim. And she told us, got us dressed, and said not to go off the back porch because she had to dress the baby and get herself ready. Well, we had no intention of going off the back porch, but the call of the wild was too much. So we wandered off, and we went over to the buggy shed. And they had just finished painting the barn a beautiful red. And there were those cans. And I suppose they were either 5 or 10-gallon cans, but big enough to catch a 4- and 5-year-old at the waist. And we got sticks, and we painted the sleigh runners, we painted the buggy wheels. And suddenly we heard Mother call, and it was, I swear, like the voice of God. We didn't even know we were doing something we shouldn't be doing, which we should have. And when she called, I dragged Jim a few steps, and he dragged me a few steps. And we finally got to the back door. Mother held it open, and we thought we'd get a good spot, but instead, I'm sure she was hysterical because she just laughed and laughed. And you know, for years we saw those clothes hanging in Grandma's closet as rags. And I felt guilty every time.
Did you get paint all over them?
Yeah, oh, we were paint from, and not only for the clothes, I'm sure we had paint on our skin also. Faces. Well, he had a wonderful time. It only took us about 5-10 minutes to do it.
Yeah. Did you learn to milk the cows like right away, or was that?
No, I never, having the 3 boys, I didn't get involved milking the cows. After we got the milker, there were a few times when the boys weren't around, or after they had left, when between hired men, Dad would need some help, and we'd go down and put the milkers on. But washing the cows' udder was even harder than putting on the milkers or taking them off.
Mm-hmm.
Hated washing the darn things.
It's like, you don't realize unless you live on a dairy farm what kind of maintenance is
Yeah,
involved.
and you're always tied to a cow's tail.
Right.
You have to milk them in the morning, you have to milk them at night. And when we would go over, particularly enjoyed going to relatives in Minneapolis. Well, one way home, you came across the free bridge. But if you came the short way, you went across the toll bridge. And I always laughed when, as an adult, when we'd come to the tender on the toll bridge. He would look in. He knew Dad, and he'd look in the car window and he'd say, "Oh, your wife and 3 children." And he'd sit there and he'd say, 7, and pay a nickel apiece.
Oh, to get across.
Yeah, and one time it really hard. Kind of amazed me, but he wouldn't back down off the number.
Well, tell us about Emily. What was it like growing up, and
Well,
what kind of things did you get into besides painting?
actually, I had one of the outstanding things. I think one of the things that probably made as big a difference as anything was having polio at 6, and I was in the hospital about 4 months. When I came home, it was winter time. I'd gone in the summer, and they put a cot next to the dining room window so I could watch the youngsters outside. But I had to start all over walking, and first I sat up, then I had to learn to creep and eventually stand and walk. I walked a long time and hung on to furniture, walls, or whatever. My balance isn't the best to this day. But when I was only 6.5, and Jim was 5.5, but we had to wipe dishes. They put me on a stool halfway between the table and the counter, and wipe dishes I did. Well, one day I'm sure I'd been princess quite a while, and decided that I wasn't going to wipe dishes. I was sick and tired of it, so I hid. Well, Mother was quite hard of hearing, and the cardinal rule was you come when you're called, so she could see us wherever we were. And just yelling back wasn't sufficient. So I stayed there, out of sight, out of sound, and when they were all done and hung up the dish pans and the light in the kitchen was turned out, I came crawling out. And Mother asked me where I was going, and I told her what I was going to do with the boys. And with that, she picked me up and eyeballed me and said, "You come when you're called," and I got 3 good swats.
Did you?
And I was totally dethroned. And from then on, I carried my shoes as I was expected to do.
Yeah.
And then, as I was older, I had a number of surgeries. Always irked me, I had to darn socks during that time. But when we had places to stand when the cattle got out, and we'd always have sieges when the fence wasn't real good and they'd get out. And then one night, our young stock got out, and there must have been about 12, 13 heifers. And it was blacker than black, and so there were not even starlight that night. And they came around the orchard and down, and I was to turn them in at the driveway, and there I was standing in the middle of the road with a cast up to my knee and two crutches. And they were a thundering herd. And as they came down, I didn't dare leave my station, so I yelled and waved the sticks, and they turned in. I wasn't sure they were going to.
It's a good
But-
thing.
Yeah, but yeah, we all had things to do, and there were things that were just kind of fun to do. And I think probably one of the things when we were ready, when my oldest brother was ready for high school, he had learned to drive, and he would drive us, and then we went to school. It really was a better education than the one-room school, but the one-room school was fun. When one time it was terribly icy, and we came to a fill, and the car slid, and it went off and tipped on the side. Well, we all walked home, and then they pulled the car out, and we still went to school that day. And we used to think he certainly thought he had to manage the family. But there was good reason. He did have a lot of responsibility. When I think of a 14 or 15-year-old driving 4 other kids to school, he did have a lot.
Yeah.
And get us back home again, pick us up wherever we had gone if there was some activity.
Mhm.
But when we went to the country school, John and Ted would make a deal with Jim and me. If we carried the lunch boxes, then they would pull us up the hills. Then they slid down the hills and we walked down, which was a lot easier than walking up and carried the lunch boxes. So we had a lot of things going.
Yeah, sounds like it. Sounds
Yeah.
like it. So you lived up there your whole life until.
Well, until I got my degree. I went to St. Cloud Teachers College for 2 years and then went out and taught. And that was, I think it's an ideal way to get started because I never minded summer school. There was always something to either investigate or research or look up.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went there 2 years, then taught in Minnesota. And then I had Beck's sarcoidosis, which is kind of an unusual disease. It kept me home for a year. And when I started teaching, I needed more rest. So my sister was living in the little town of Elmwood, Wisconsin. And she said, why didn't I come over there and teach? And they had such a long lunch hour that I could have lunch and a rest at noon and then in the afternoon. So I stayed at the banker's home and went over and had meals with them, which was delightful. And then the superintendent moved to Nakusa, which was a paper town. By then I had my degree. That next summer I had gotten it from the University of Minnesota. And I went to, he said, come and be a teaching principal, which I did. And the paper mill wanted their teachers to have a better level of education to teach the youngsters and so that they got a better education. And so they offered 3/4 of all expenses to go to summer school. And they didn't care where you went, so I went to Colorado. I thought that was a great place to go. And got my master's there. I went summers. And then when I had the master's degree, neither Minnesota nor Wisconsin wanted to pay the extra salary. Mm-hmm. But at that time, Illinois had kind of a drive on to get more teachers with masters. And when the assistant superintendent at St. Charles contacted me, so I went to St. Charles And from there, I went to the lab school at Northern Illinois. And that was a fascinating experience. There's nothing like having the sophomore and junior teachers come in and observe every day and want to know why and what for. It really makes you a thinking teacher.
Oh, sure, sure.
'Cause
So
you
you were
don't-
the teacher, and then they would come in and
They
you
would
would...
come in and observe. Yeah. But
Wow.
those, it was an interesting place to be. One of the experiments they did was to put all the boys and from first grade into one room and the girls in the other room to see if there were different ways of reaching the boys, of changing the curriculum for them. There were many. I had the luck of getting the boys, and were they ever fun? They let me in, and when one of the rules was that they had to keep their shoes clean because we had carpeting, and it was so funny because when they knew what the guideline was, they would make their own rules for doing it. And when I think of all the years I fussed at kids about putting on boots, or they had to stay on the sidewalk if they didn't have them and all that. But here they had a wonderful time. They took care of it beautifully. And when we were in the spring, we'd had a spring rain and there was a great big mud puddle at the bottom of the slide. And I couldn't quite figure out how they were managing it, but they'd come down that slide going as fast as they could, jump over the mud, and get off all right. And I finally got over close enough to hear what the game was, but there were alligators in that water. There was no way they were going to, so they would help each other get across, but they had a wonderful time. But that was just the way the year went. There were all kinds of things they did. Another year, we had, they would do little skits, and each morning, when somebody had an idea for a play, it was part of the morning opening activities, they would write their name on the blackboard, and they could have 3 others. And they didn't do well when the group was more than 4, but 4 they knew who was still boss. And they were doing, well, one time they were sitting around a make-believe, no, I guess it was a real table, and it was a mother and father and 2 children. And when they passed the plate, the mother said she had to eat the peas. And the youngster said, shook her head no. And then the mother got more insistent. And so she took the spoon, you would think her trying to force feed her. So the youngster took the imaginary peas, and as soon as she had made the, it gave the impression of swallowing, she got up and turned around and threw up. You know, the kids nodded their heads, you know, they knew exactly what was going on. They were so delightful in things they did, because they really did understand. That was not good as far as they were concerned.
Yeah, no. You taught for 36 years.
Yes.
And was it all at...
No. Then the lab school came on a hard time, so I came over, they were looking for a primary consultant in this district, 102. So I came over here. And then eventually we came on hard times, and I then became a classroom teacher again. And I don't know why I ever left it. It was by far the most fun. One of the summers when I had gone to summer school, which always gave me a chance to find things in the law library, I loved to read the latest research. Well, one of the research items that I read was done in England, and they had taken 20 people from a mental institution, and 10 of them had sat in a group and talked about what had happened to them and how bad they felt and so forth. The other 10 were taught the social graces, to shake hands, to look somebody in the eye, repeat their name, and yes, you talk about the weather, anything that happened to be going on. 5 years later, when they'd done a follow-up of the people that had been in the circle, there were only one or two still out in the public. And those that had been taught the social graces, only one of them was back in the institution.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, there is something about knowing when you meet people, and that's often where they have such difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
So when the children came in the morning, I shook hands with them and got the day's news about what was important in their lives, and they started with their work. And then at night when they left, I again shook hands with them at the door as they left and gave them, mentioned something they could talk about at home, where they had done well, whether it was helping somebody or whatever they had performed well in, and left. Well, when I was substituting after I retired, and I was walking with the kindergarten group down the hall, and the kids would speak to me that had been in my class. They never hesitated. And finally one of the little boys shook my hand and he said, "Does everybody know you?" Seemed like a lot to him. But there was a lot of interesting things, sort of an outcome. When I had reading groups, I wore a hat that I had gotten in Jamaica and had lots of pink straw on it. And I could not be interrupted when I was with the reading group. And everybody had a job. If there were 26 kids in the room, we had 27 jobs. I also got one. And then on Monday, we always rotated them. Everybody moved down. Well, you always have a few youngsters that are really very shy, but they wouldn't give up their opportunity to take the job, even if it's a job that it did mean they had to meet people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I had the hat on, one of the child who was in charge had to answer anybody that came to the door. Nobody interrupted that reading group. And they were so funny, you could just see them when the knock would come and the others would turn and look. And this very shy youngster would get up and have to say to the principal or whoever came, "I'm sorry, Miss Kernkamp is busy. Can I take a message?" She thought it was so funny that she often came to the room. But, and then when it came to helping, they'd often wait until I'd picked up some of the paper before some of the others would come along and help. Or if it was putting chairs up, whatever the job was, we had enough to go around. And they were fun to work with.
Oh, yeah. What grade level was this?
That first and
First
second.
and second?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then I had kindergarten. One year I had third grade. But the primary was by far the most interesting. One of the things that got me started on travel, and I have thoroughly enjoyed that, was the woman that I lived with. We shared a house, and after we each had an apartment in the apartment building, we decided that we'd do better than having all that rent go down the drain to at least put it into a house. So she was an intrepid traveler. She had her doctorate in psychology and liked traveling, and so why not go along? So that was really my introduction. I think we went to Hawaii several times, and then one of the outstanding trips was to the Antarctic. And we went down there, had an awfully good time.
Oh, yeah.
And I was surprised that in the Antarctic you have penguins but no polar bears. In the Arctic you have polar bears and no penguins. So we saw them both, but we eventually went up to the Churchill for the polar bear migration. But we did a lot of traveling. And then we came here to Plymouth Place, which was kind of funny. We had been to Australia, and a cousin of mine wanted to see my slides of New Zealand and Australia. And so I drove up to Minnesota. He was in a nursing home and had a stroke. And his brother, who was just a year older than I, had come over to see them too. And we were sitting just visiting in a little room, and Raj turned to me and he said, "When are you going to move?" By then we had retired. And I said, "Oh, don't be silly. We aren't going to move for 10 years. And he turned to me and he said, "That's the biggest mistake some of our friends and relatives make. You can't move after one of them becomes sick, incapacitated, and pull the rug out. He says, that isn't the time. You need to do it before you get to that place." So I came back, and Doug and I in a flurry looked at a lot of different retirement places. We knew we wanted to retire here. We had so many good friends in our peer group, and so we looked, and then kind of went on the back burner. And then it was a year later, and the light bulb in the porch was out. So we took the step stool out, and I thought I'd put the light bulb in my hip pocket of my jeans, but had not. And so there I was standing on the step stool with my cane to be sure I had good balance. And this young woman came driving down Harding Avenue, turned the corner on Kensington, slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the van, and she yelled as she came across the yard, "You shouldn't be doing that." I was sure I'd heard the voice of God. And she knew us as the old ladies on the corner, and her kids had come up and danced in the flowers. But we went inside, and we looked at each other and said, "You know, she's right." So then we got serious, and we came over here.
Okay.
And were in one of the cottages for 10 years. But I haven't then when I had a heart attack a year ago, I stayed in the healthcare, and they did a wonderful job of getting me over here in an apartment.
Wonderful. So you had the cottage, and then you
Then
had
went to the health
healthcare?
service, came over here, and come spring, I'm going to start traveling again.
There you go. There you go. So while you were teaching, every summer you would travel? Pretty much every
we
summer?
traveled. Sometimes we traveled during vacations.
Okay.
While I was teaching, yes, I wasn't going to summer school as much when I came here. The one time, the Easter vacation, I went down the Amazon, and Doug didn't go on that one. I went with my sister and brother-in-law, and she said she didn't want to go where it was so hot and buggy. She wouldn't have any fun, and she said I wouldn't be fun to have around. She was right. But it was an interesting trip.
I bet. So you took slides of every trip that you went on?
I have, at first I made the mistake of taking both pictures and slides, and some of the best are always on the other thing.
Yeah.
So I finally gave up and just did slides.
Did slides, yeah.
Yeah.
They're so real when you put them up on the...
But that's really passé now.
Is it?
Yeah, I think the computers and pictures and...
Well, yeah. But I don't know. You know, carousel just, gives such good color, and you almost feel like you're right in
Oh,
the
I know.
picture. Yeah.
I like them
Beautiful.
very much. And I have, one of the things I like is I have shown some of them here because it gives me a chance to look at them
Sure.
and
Absolutely.
enjoy them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But what made you get into teaching? Is it just...
Well, it was kind of a strange incident. After high school, I really wanted to go into nursing. Of course, I'd had a lot of time in and out of hospitals. And the pediatrician said, no, the orthotic man said no. Orthopedic, can't get there. He said no, and the family doctor said no, it was too much hard work on my feet. I was ornery, disagreeable, teenager at that time, and so that was during the war, and they needed girls in Washington, D.C., so I took off and went out there to work. The first time I'd been on a train, the first time I'd been that far from home, but I went and lived in the quarters they had in Arlington, Virginia, for the government girls. Worked in the State Department and wrote seaman passports.
Okay.
And during that year and a half I was there, Mother had a heart attack, and I had 3 younger sisters in high school, and I knew that I needed to get back and at least help weekends.
Mm-hmm.
So I did. I went home. I went back and got a job in Minneapolis, and went home weekends. And while I was there, the Sunday school superintendent at church said they needed a teacher for one of the Sunday school classes. So I taught that class. Well, I had never seriously considered teaching, but I thoroughly enjoyed that. And I liked it so much, one of my aunts said that if I wanted to go and take the 1-year course, and they still had the 1-year course for the one-room country school,
Wow.
that she would help me with the tuition and room and board.
Mm-hmm.
So I went that year, and then she said, I really should get the 2-year. That there was such a difference in salaries and opportunities. The one-room schools were definitely going out, and there was a lot more. So I went the 2nd year. Then the rest of the way I worked and went along. But I had some interesting experiences. When I was out in western Minnesota at Appleton, the primary school was the old high school. The high school was new in junior high, and they had the upper grades. We were just 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in the old high school building. And September had been really hot, and when I had wanted to open the windows, I thought they were very thick glass, very narrow and high. And so I had to use a window stick. And the hole had worn so that eventually, either shutting or opening it, the stick slipped out of the hole and cracked the window, probably 12, 15 inches. And I reported it to the superintendent and to the custodian, and nobody seemed to much care. Well, on the 10th of October, was in 1950, we had a terrible windstorm. There were gusts of wind that clocked around 80 miles an hour. And across the street from my end of that building was the Lutheran church. And when a parishioner died, they rang one bell for each 10 years, and we always counted how old the parishioner was. Well, this was an 80-some-year-old, and then they would do the ones closer together, so we'd count that. I think it was about 88. It was a lot. But it was a gloomy, terrible day, and about 3 o'clock. And the youngsters were stressed. Well, we all were. And I decided we weren't going to get much done that last 15 minutes. So I said I'd read a story to them. So my desk was in the back of the room. And just as I started to the back, probably gotten 3/4 the way back there, there was a noise, and I will never know why I said firmly and loudly, duck. And they did under their desks.